And what a way to start a session by muting the person who's introducing you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tom Hopkins. I'm a member of the Fair Museum Jobs Committee, and my day job is Curator of Aircraft at the Royal Air Force Museum. Welcome to this session on how to do well with covering letters and personal specifications, as they're sometimes called. Many of you starting out for the first time with the application process may really struggle about how to do it, but there really are some right ways to do it and some definite wrong ways as well. So to talk you through these, I'm joined today by a fantastic panel. So thank you to you for attending. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, and then we'll get the ball rolling with the discussion. So I'm going to go clockwise from my screen at least, and over to you, Mark, please.
Hello, it's great to be here, and thanks to the Fair Museum's job for putting together this amazing, sprawling event. My name is Mark Carnall, and I'm a collections manager at Oxford University Museum of Natural History. I've worked in national museums and university museums and done recruitment for those, as well as sitting externally on other boards. So that'll be the perspective that I'll be coming from.
Thank you. Jenny?
Good morning. I'm Jenny Schwartzberg. I'm the Curator of Education at the Historic New Orleans Collection in New Orleans, Louisiana, US. We are a museum, research center, and publisher. And I, in my short tenure as Curator of Education, have run 2 job searches. So I'm happy to share my experiences from those 2 job searches.
Thank you very much. Sam?
Hello, I'm Sam Jenkins. I'm the collections officer at the People's History Museum. I am at the moment furloughed. I've always got to make this announcement. I'm furloughed. I'm doing this on my own time. But over the last 5 years, I think I've had a ridiculous number of jobs and have got job applications down to a formula. So that's the perspective I'm going to be sharing today.
Thank you very much, Sam. And I should say that I've certainly done a lot more job applications than I have recruitment as well. But yeah, I equally feel that I've got my formula quite honed now. And Carl.
Hello, everybody. I'm Karl Newbold, and I work at Leeds Museums and Galleries as a learning and access officer there, in particular on a project called Careers for All. And my experience, a lot of it has actually come from my previous job where I worked at the Royal Armouries as well as education officer there. And we essentially recruited an education team while I was there. But I've also recruited a freelance evaluator for the project that I'm currently running as well. So that will be.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to start off with a big question, which is: should a covering letter be an elegant essay, or should it be something more structured? And from a recruiter's point of view, when you receive that covering letter or that personal specification, how do they set about scoring them? And I'm going to go to Mark first, please.
Yeah. So. When I applied for lots of jobs, but it was only when I really did recruitment training that it's kind of like, completely demystifying the whole process and doing that recruitment training. So learning how to recruit was really, really useful. And I thought this is, it's completely different to what I thought I was trying to do when applying for jobs. So it's great that we can share some of that experience now. So I'm just going to talk a little bit through what happens with your application. So you see a job advert. Normally there'll be reams and reams about the history of the museum, details of the role, and then often there'll be a bit which is essential and desirable criteria. Then, unfortunately, because we all do things very, very differently. So if you're applying for a lot of jobs, you'll be very used to, okay, this institution wants, it has a form that I have to fill out and my CV, or they want my CV and a covering letter plus my school certificates or whatever. So it can be a bit frustrating to essentially do the same task over and over and over, but in different formats. But essentially, When you put together that application pack, so it might be a CV, it might be a covering letter, it might be a form, that will go to the recruitment panel. And depending on the job role and the time of year, you'll end up with a virtual or a huge stack of applications. And then what the recruitment panel does, and this is the bit that kind of blew my mind, is you will have the job description. So here's one I have here with the essential criteria and the desirable criteria here. And you go through each of those applications and you score against those criteria. So, you literally write down a little score. So it might be you're scoring, if you fully met a criteria, that'll be a 2. If you've partially met it, it'll be a 1. If you've not met it at all, it'll be a 0. And then we split those between essential and desirable criteria. Then each of the members of the recruitment panel will come together and compare those scores. 9 times out of 10, the recruitment panel will have consensus. So there'll be a clear 5 or 6 which have come out as top. And sometimes there's some debate about backup candidates or a number 5 or a number 6, in which case normally you go back to the application forms and to see how one person might have thought that somebody should have get an interview or not. And so that's what happens with your application. And there is a little bit of disparity, as we mentioned earlier, about what the different pieces of documentation are doing. So sometimes, rarely, I think in the UK, it might be different elsewhere, the covering letter is just the administrative top slip, if you like. So the bulk of where you're trying to address these criteria sits in something like the CV, or if you've got a form to fill in with drop downs, it will be there. A lot of the time, however, particularly if you see an application that just says you want a covering letter and a CV, is that covering letter is doing the meat. So that should be where all of your energy should be in specifically addressing the criteria, almost surgically, I think. So what you really want to do is you want to make it. I'll say, and I think everyone will agree. Most recruiters are really looking to find the best person who fits the role, and probably lean on the generous side of kind of scoring points or whether they think people meet the criteria. And what you want to make it as hard as possible for the recruitment panel to miss areas where you do have an expertise. So yeah, I'll hand it over to the others to talk about essay or not in the covering.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mark. Very much a demystification of the process there, and a really good insight into what happens behind the scenes. Does anybody else have any views on this? I'm going to go to Sam.
Definitely, because this is where my formula comes in. So I was luckily given some advice early on in my career about how recruiters recruit and how to make the best out of covering letter, personal statement, whatever you want to call it. And so I was told that because recruiters are likely to be looking at tens, if not hundreds of applications, you want to make it as obvious as possible that you are meeting the criteria, because a lot of the time they don't have the time, or they might be on their 50th application and they're going a little bit application blind. So I don't write like an essay ever when doing personal statements. Instead, I use headings, I use bullet points, numbers, put things in bold. So you go through the criteria one by one, like number 1, this is why I meet the criteria, in 3 sentences, saying that you have the experience, sort of when you got it, where you were working. The second sentence is an example, and then the third sentence is how confident you are in your ability to meet that criteria. Which means that you can also use that to discuss criteria that you don't necessarily meet, but you can still use the system of, when I was working here, I did this thing that is very similar, and that is why I think that I can learn this criteria, or I have the transferable skills for it as well.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. And I think there's definitely something to be said for structure as well. Going through it on a point-by-point blow, and usually in the same order that it appears on the personal specification, because that's probably going to tie into the scoring grid that Mark discussed, and you're just going to make life a lot easier for whoever's recruiting. Carl, did you have anything that you wanted to say? You seem to have frozen, so I think I'll move on, and yeah, talk about ways that you can make a covering letter as easy to read as possible. We obviously touched upon making it structured. Are there any other tips that anybody's got? Would you use bullet points, for instance, Mark?
Yeah, I think what Sam is saying is that, so in an ideal world, you get your stack of 100 applications and you go and sit in the glorious sun next to a babbling brook, and you really dwell over the kind of opportunity you've got to change someone's future career prospects. In reality, you are probably doing it under time pressure, and depending on how many applications have come in, and so although it does seem a bit heartless and a bit formulaic in structuring it in such a way, with exactly what Sam was saying, bullet points in bold, in the order that you find them on the application, it just kind of edges your chances that someone won't miss a key point that's on there, and sometimes it can be very difficult, particularly with things like a CV, because you really want to be evidencing that you've done something. So even though you might be addressing a criteria that falls into one of the responsibilities you had in one of your previous jobs. So let's say it's you need to have this is a crap criteria, but you need to have a good working knowledge of museum documentation systems. It might be missed if you've just represented that in your CV as I've been a cataloger for 2 years. So really putting out and saying I've working with the criteria that you've got, but saying I've done it and then evidencing it. So look at the wording of the criteria. So things like willingness and awareness are kind of a gift, because if you say the sentence, I am aware of blah, 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 that is 2 points, right? There's no doubt about that. The more difficult ones are things like working knowledge, experience, where you should go into details. So I have experience doing blah, blah, blah. And then, a couple of sentences laying out exactly that experience in detail, rattling off a little list of all the things, because it's probably that your recruiters are thinking about those things in terms of the interview, right? If we talk about museum documentation, we want them to talk about Spectrum, and we want to talk about collections management systems. So just make it as robust as possible to hit that fully met or partially met. And I would say, I think I saw a question in the chat, where some bad recruitment happens. Sometimes a job will have 18 essential criteria and 2 pages in which to do it, in which case I think prioritize the essential ones that you meet over the unessential ones. And if there are a whole bunch which are sort of on the same topic, bundle those up and address them under one paragraph to kind of give you some more breathing room to talk about some of the other ones.
Yeah, and you will come across really, really tight word limits, and I think you've just got to do the best that you can. And it sometimes feels like an impossible task, but it's not really the case. I think anybody who has ever had experience going through in the Imperial War Museum's recruitment process, I don't know if it's the same now, but they used to give you a very strict character count, which worked out to about 500 words. But actually, that's in some ways a good exercise, because it makes you focus on what they're really actually looking for without having any of the waffle. Carl.
Yeah, sorry, my internet went a bit blurry at a point there, so I've come back a bit closer to the router. Going back to kind of the original question, I think structured and succinct is definitely the way to go. One person very early on my career gave me a bit of advice, which I thought was so handy, which they said, when you read through a covering letter or an application, imagine that you're having to pay £1 for every word you're using, and then really look at your application and work out what words is just waffle and what do I not need. And the words that you have left often are sort of the skeleton that are hitting that point that you need to get. And very much from a reading application point of view, I find it so much easier. We talked about having the criteria picked off by saying, you know, do you have experience writing databases? And it's great to put, I have experience writing databases because, but it's also really handy from my point of view to be able to read them in order as well. So if they are in the order that they're written in the application, again, it's just so much quicker and so much easier for the person reading your application to know that you've picked those points correctly, because they just follow top to bottom. So that would be a bit of advice that I would give: £1 for every word, and do it in order.
Yeah, I really don't think that can be emphasised enough. We've had a question in the chat about how universal is this scoring system that Mark demonstrated at the beginning of this session. In my experience, it is universal throughout universities, local government and national museums. A lot of independent museums may not have any formal HR support, so may do their own thing. However, I would say that a structured covering letter is never going to do you harm. They're not going to look at something that is really broken down and say, oh my gosh, this hasn't been written as an elegant essay, therefore I'm going to mark it down. I just don't think that's going to happen.
I could weigh in from a US point of view.
Yeah, I was just going to ask okay. about that, Jenny, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I would say in the US, in my experience, cover letters are expected to be more of an essay format. If I received a cover letter that was broken down into bullet points, I wouldn't necessarily take that as a strike against the candidate, but I know a lot of hiring managers that would. So I definitely still think clear language, don't be verbose, get rid of most of your adjectives, vary up your sentence construction, but keep it kind of, straight to the point, hit those points of expertise, just like everybody else has been saying, but have it more in a paragraph format for US jobs.
Is the scoring system common?
Well, I think it's exactly like you're saying. I know for many state and federal government jobs here, there are very rigid ways of organizing those scores. I work at a small private museum, and HR, after the job posts, is not even involved in our hiring processes. So it is absolutely up to the hiring manager. I personally do use a similar system just because it's easy, because we usually get hundreds of applications for each job. But I think it's totally dependent on what the type of organization is.
And I guess independent private museums make up the bulk of the US sector, whereas that tends not to be the case in the UK. So,
absolutely.
That's if I had to put my money on it, that's probably the driver behind the differences there. Mark?
Yeah, I imagine this has come out in different sessions. We've already talked a little bit about some disparity. It can be quite intimidating, particularly with lots of different systems in an application. So if there's any doubt, or you're really stressing about, should I be doing this, should I be doing that, I would recommend getting in touch with the institution and just clarifying I'm interested, I'm looking forward to applying to a job. You just clarify to me, where should I be putting my emphasis on my application, and that we don't keep secret lists of, oh, this person got in touch with us and didn't know how to fill out an application form. We want to help you as much as possible, and then also it can really help you. But okay, so that's where I'm going to put my energy, because it can be opaque, and like I say, like we've already emphasised, it really varies quite highly. So do get in touch with people if you're really struggling. So we don't want you to waste your time, and also we don't want to waste our own time hunting for information that's been buried perhaps in the wrong place.
One of the things we said yesterday in our session on how to make recruitment processes fairer and more accessible is absolutely put contact details onto job adverts. And as a good hiring manager, you should expect questions before you receive applications, because you're not going to get everything right. There will be things on the job advert that will be unclear. So those recruiters should be expecting questions. So don't ever feel afraid to ask something, a bit of clarification before you put a job advert in. So thank you for all of that. Carl?
Yeah, and sort of building on that, I think sometimes actually asking those questions, if you have them, don't just ask them for the sake of it, but sometimes it can make you a little bit more memorable as well. So I've definitely had it before, actually, where I've applied for a job and I rang up and I had a couple of questions, but it turned into a bit of a conversation. And it meant that when I went to interview, they were already quite familiar with who I was, and I think it gave me like sort of a slight boost, and showed that I was taking the post and the application seriously as well, sort of questioning my own professional development too, as to whether I would fit the role. So yeah, it's not seen as a negative thing from the employer point of view if you do, providing your question is a pertinent one.
Yeah, thanks for that, Carl. I see Sam's got a hand up, so I'm going to ask her to speak in a bit. But can I just ask you, Carl, if having that phone conversation with the recruiter or one of the recruiters beforehand made you feel more comfortable and confident during the interview process?
Yeah, I think for me it did. There was sort of an element of uncertainty, and I used to have a teacher at school who said it's better to be a fool for a minute than for the rest of your life. So if you've got that question and you can set your own mind at ease, then I would definitely recommend it.
Thank you. And Sam?
I was basically going to say the same thing. Having phoned up with questions for a few jobs before, it sort of gets you over that initial nervousness with meeting new people. So when you have the interview, then you don't have that sort of room full of strangers that you're talking to. It's someone that you've had a conversation with before, usually at least.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think we've got a session on social media on Sunday, and part of that I think I'd like to discuss being interviewed by people you know on Twitter, because it's a bit less scary. You've got that baseline of them being less of a stranger, so that takes some of the panic out of it. I'm going to ask now about evidence and how important it is to evidence things. I know we've sort of touched on this before, but does anybody have any specific techniques in which they would write a covering letter to make sure that they really justified that point on the spec they were trying to get? Sam?
I'll do this as someone who's done a stupid number of cover letters. As I said, I tend to follow a formula that say the application forms, the person specification said that essential criteria is experience with collections databases. I'd say over my last however many roles, I've worked with various collections databases, including EMU, MIMSI, and AdLib as the first sentence. And then the second sentence would be a specific example. So as collections officer, I am responsible for the documentation of the People's History Museum's collection on the collections database EMU on a day-to-day basis. And that then succinctly evidences that I'm not just talking out my arse, for want of a better phrase. I'm not just saying that I meet the criteria when I actually don't. You're giving an actual example of, like, I do this every day. It doesn't have to be really long. You don't have to go into every single time that you've catalogued something or a particular difficult thing to catalogue. It's just showing that you do actually do what you're saying you do.
One of my top tips for collections jobs as well is find out what collections management system the organisation you're applying to uses, and make specific reference to it.
Yeah.
Because that will get you noticed.
Yes, and just to jump in there as well, if you are applying for a collections management role and you do need experience with databases, that's also a really easy transferable skill, because while each database is slightly different, they're all essentially the same, and all databases really function in the same sort of way. So if you've got experience with databases from an admin role you did for a local shop or something, you can still pull that through. If you don't have experience of collections management databases, you still got experience of databases. And that is why you think that you would be able to pick up collections management systems easily. And I think that's the thing. It doesn't always have to be right on the nose of what the experience is, as long as it's transferable. But make sure you get, if you're using a transferable skill as your evidence, make sure you get a sentence in there that says why that's transferable and why you think that that means that you'll be able to pick up this skill or develop that knowledge in the job.
Jenny.
Thanks. Yeah, I absolutely echo what Sam said. I think any chance that you have a place to give specifics, whether that's if it's a program you created, attendance numbers or registration numbers, titles of things you've done, because all of those details will, I think, in the minds of the recruiters and hiring managers, make you a memorable candidate. So it's great to use those general statements like I have experience in this, you know, I have expert level knowledge in this, but giving those details in your cover letter are the things that I think makes an outstanding candidate.
Yeah, thank you. Carl.
I would also add that you should evidence all of the points in the criteria, particularly the essential. And this is even if it's a covering letter and a CV. And for example, one for my sector in education is has worked with children and young people. If your CV says that you were a teacher for 5 years, for example, don't think that therefore you shouldn't put it in your covering letter, because that's going to be a really important point of the role. So don't just think, oh, well, it's in my CV, so I don't need to explicitly say I have worked with children and young people through doing this. Yeah, so just something to be mindful of that I've seen in applications that I've read over in the past.
Yeah, a lot of this week we've been talking about the importance of transferable skills. I still rely on my experience of working in supermarket retail for Morrison's for a whole host of things, especially communication, diplomacy, things like that. It's still relevant, and that's where I learned the bulk of my, for want of a better word, soft skills. Mark.
Yeah, just on the evidencing, it's particularly important to do all the things that the rest of the panel have said, particularly in the museum sector, because there's very little parity in what job titles mean from institution to institution. So, you know, the example that we tend to use a lot is curator. A curator at a small museum may do everything, you know, the learning program, cleaning the toilets, opening up, whereas a curator at a university may essentially just be an academic. So you really can't rely, you know, and we've got all this mad language around officers, assistants, and at one institution that could be a really, really senior role, in another institution that could be a very, very junior role. So yeah, really don't rely on those job titles, because the people recruiting you may have just been in one particular kind of institution, and yeah, just getting around what we've already mentioned in terms of saying, you know, I was a cataloger at a national museum. I would think, well, perhaps that means you're doing one very narrow bit over and over and over, but we need somebody who can come in and set up our entire documentation system. Whereas if you say, you know, I'm a cataloger and I've loans in, loans out, blah blah blah, and I worked on accreditation, again, it just satisfies that, okay, yes, you have done that, rather than you know, are you perhaps making more of something than is actually there? If you evidence it, you should remove that element of doubt.
Thanks. I've seen it coming up in the chat, but somebody has brought up the STAR response to questions. I think this is a really useful tool to evidence things. So STAR stands for situation, task, action, response. And it's just a way of writing down scenarios in which you gained experience through having usually a positive result. I mean, I wouldn't want to put a negative one, I think, in a job application, although of course it's perfectly valid to learn from failure. But I'm going to ask Louise if she could find an article on that. I know there's one on The Guardian that's quite good, and pop it into the chat. It's also really good for interviews as well, and preparing for interview answers. So I really recommend that. I'm going to go on to quite a difficult question now, and one for which I think we'll get a variety of responses from the panel, and that is, how long should a covering letter be? Mark.
Yeah, fair recruitment should mean that institutions specifically specify what they want and what they need, which is dodging the question, so the rest of the panel can pick up the rest. But I will say, for some places that I've worked, if there is a word count, and the application form will let you overrun that word count, you are strictly told you do not read. You know, if it's 1,000 words and somebody's put in 3,000 words, that you, to make it a part of fair recruitment, is you cannot read the remaining 2,000 words. Now, you know, does that mean that people are sitting there counting every single word and saying, okay, this is where I stop? No, but yeah, so do try to go with what's stipulated. If it isn't stipulated, that is very difficult. Because obviously there's an advantage there in just writing the longest covering letter that ever existed to make sure you've got anything. But I think too long, that starts to run against your favour. But yeah, I'll be interested to see what other people's responses are
there. Jenny?
I would say around a page for US positions. I think for the most part, the way this is seen in the US is that your resume or CV is, and I will also say most positions in the US ask for a resume, not a CV. Interesting. It's kind of a shorter version. Your resume is kind of like the just deep, bare bones facts about your experience. The cover letter is showing how you are one piece of a puzzle that matches to the job description. So you want to demonstrate in your cover letter your written communication skills and how you match to that position, but you've got to keep it short. It is almost an impossible task. I'm not trying to say it's a good way to do things, but this is just what I've encountered. It's around a page.
Thanks for that. In British English, CV means a resume, and we don't really have a word for what Americans call a CV, which is quite interesting.
Gotcha.
Describe an American CV would be like one big master CV where you put absolutely everything that you've ever done.
Absolutely everything. Yes, and like high school jobs you had, every award you've won, like absolutely everything. Whereas a resume is more like your relevant experience.
And you tailor it right to the job you're applying for.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm going to suggest that you can go over a page for UK jobs. And I think if you make it structured, you've already made it a lot easier for the person who's scoring it. And that's probably going to afford you a few more pages than you might normally have. So I've done a 4-page covering letter before, which has got me to interview. I think I may even have done 5 before, with nicely spread out, lots of gaps, nice and easy to read. I would say 6 is definitely getting on for too much, and 1 is probably not enough. However, it entirely depends on the number of criteria you have on the personal specification. And the worst example I've seen has had 42 individual criteria. And it's just like, why? Why would you do that? I mean, they probably say it's an HR requirement. Fix your HR, it's not working for you. It's broken. I know it's not always easy to do that, but yeah, that's too many points. Sam or Carl, did you have any insights into how long a covering letter should be?
I think same as you, I've varied wildly depending on the number of requirements employers have put in. If I've seen applications with only about 10 essential criteria, so I think the covering letter for that can easily be a page, maybe a page and a half. But yeah, if there's 25 essential criteria and then some desirable criteria on top of that, they're doing it wrong. But you can't try and keep that covering letter to a page doing it in the structured way that suits the British museum sector. But I think the big thing that I do is my first draft will just be write everything, and then I redraft it. And I don't redraft it by going through and changing words as I read it. I completely rewrite it in a second screen. And I think that helps cut it down a lot. So I think usually my first draft is about 3,000 words. But then my second draft is about half that. And I think one of the big things I want to raise with this is it's mostly because I tend to use passive voice when writing first drafts. It's something that I fell into the academic hole of writing long flowing, flowery sentences. And that doesn't suit job applications. You really want an active voice. You want to be saying like, I did this, not this was done by me at this time. And if you've got Microsoft Word, then there is a system now that you can set passive voice checks on with your spelling and grammar. And so that really helps, and that helps to cut down the word count as well, because it quite often turns a 50-word sentence into a 25-word sentence.
I think there's a lot to be said about using active voice and action words and positive language as well. And that it has some sort of strange psychological effect on whoever's scoring your application, and you can hoodwink them into believing that you're a really positive, go-getter, dynamic, super duper addition to the team. They absolutely must hire. Carl, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, before I sort of go back to the covering letter length, I'm going to go a little bit off topic and talk about like interview and about active voice in that as well. In that saying I instead of we is something that I often use because it's just the way my mind works. I think about team and group a lot more than I do myself as an individual. And it can happen, I think, at both application and interview, that if you have done something, say, I did this, because I have missed out on job opportunities in the past by, essentially I said, we did this, we had this project, my team did this, and what I really should have said was I managed it and the people who were in my team did these jobs because I had delegated them. And I think that's a really careful thing that you can do in applications as well. In terms of covering letter length, it's something that I don't really have much experience on, because often when I've been asked to do covering letters for applications that I've done in the past, there's been the separate application process, and therefore the covering letter for me has always been short. I don't think I've ever written a cover letter above 2 pages, and that's partly to do with sort of the criteria being asked to be met in the application form and process instead. So it's not the most helpful of answers, but but it's the experience that I've had.
Yeah, no, I think that's really useful. Thanks. We had a question about whether the length of a cover letter or a CV should differ depending on your level of experience and just where you're at with your career. And I don't think it should for covering letters necessarily. I think as you get more experienced, you can maybe think about letting your CV get a bit longer. But I'd say never ever go over three pages for a CV, and try to stick to 2 wherever you can. Is it just 1 page in the US for resumes, Jenny?
Around a page, yes.
Yeah, thanks. Sam?
On the subject of CVs, I think someone's given this advice before as well, to keep a bulk CV with absolutely everything and all of your experience, all the retail jobs you did, any like volunteering that you've done, whether you think it's relevant to museums or not. You never know when you're going to get one of those horrible application forms that needs you to do your full working history since you were born. And they can be really useful to make sure you've got everything there already written. But if you are sending in if you ask to send in a cover letter and CV to an application form, reformat that to make sure it meets the specifications and the requirements of the job you're applying to.
Thanks. Carl?
And just adding on to that as well, sometimes you'll get applications that ask for training that you've done as well. And I've had ones where, you know, just stuff from my past that I regretted I didn't write down the date and who the provider of it, because I did things like diversity training, special educational needs and disabilities training, even things like, you know, manual handling, stuff like that. So always keep up to date and keep a record. One of my big regrets was when I was in a job for 4 years and I didn't update CVs. And I got to the point where I was applying for my next job and I was like, oh no. And it was so much more effort because I hadn't taken the time to update it. And since then, I update it regularly to make sure that when an application does come up, I have all the information there and I've remembered it.
I think that's a really important point, and also save all of your covering letters as well. They ask usually for quite similar things, and if you can get a really good paragraph, really evidenced paragraph about how you meet one of those skills that comes up time and time again, like communication or teamwork or something like that, it is usually fine to copy and paste that individual paragraph across covering letters. You don't have to reinvent the wheel each time. It just saves you work. So yes, do that. Question about whether you should format the covering letter as a letter. I would say yes, because it doesn't add substantially to the word count, and it shows that you can write a letter. Does anybody else have any thoughts on this? Mark?
Yeah, I hope we just get rid of calling it covering letter soon. It's just one of those weird holdover things where at one point, you know, that was the functional part of the application because that would be the letter you sent to the institution. So yeah, and again, if the place doesn't specify, I've spotted a few questions about, you know, who do you address covering letters to if there's not an obvious contact. If the institution is not giving you that information, then don't sweat it too much. You know, we're not looking to open your application and say, oh, they've addressed it to you know, the wrong kind of person, so that's, we're going to take points off somebody. So yeah, just if it's not specified, just do what you're comfortable with. So yeah, you know, do you have the letterhead, but I think I'd say it's extremely rare that you know, anyone's assessing whether you can address a letter or not. Perhaps the Postal Museum, I don't know. So yeah, it's one of those weird antiquated things, and it would just be better for everybody if it's disappeared completely, but it is.
I agree with you as a direction to move into the future. And I would also say actually never format it as a letter if it's if you're going through a portal and it gives you a sort of a box to fill, and it will probably call it a personal statement rather than a covering letter in that session. You are just wasting character count in that scenario. Only if it calls it a covering letter would I do that. There may be something there. I don't know. Sam?
I don't think I've ever formatted a covering letter as an actual letter, apart from for my first job, which I had to post through the shop's letterbox. But I think there's a lot to be said about general formatting that you would potentially use for a letter. So instead of, like, you don't have to have the address of the museum there because it's not going through the post, but things like putting "Dear Sir," "Dear Madam," "Dear Mr. XYZ," and then formatting your paragraphs and your bullet points in an easy to read way, using like paragraph indents like you would with a letter. I think that's worth it because it all helps with the readability, especially like if you are having to send something through email. whether you're writing your cover letter as the email, also attach it as a Word document, and be aware that if you're sending emails, it may change the formatting when the person receives it. So you want to try and make sure that you're doing like double paragraph spaces to make sure the paragraphs are there. And that goes as well if you're drafting a cover letter or personal statement in Word to then put into a portal. Double check the formatting, because quite often it removes the formatting that you've put in Word. So go back through it and make sure you're putting in your paragraph spaces.
Yeah, I think it's really important that you don't have it in the body of the email, that it is a separate document, because it's going to help the person to file it. It's just, you're saving them a job, basically. Word or as a PDF, though, does it matter? Jenny?
I was going to say I absolutely prefer PDFs, because for whatever reason, between different versions of Word, people have different types of computers. PDF is something that'll keep that formatting constant, and that is my go-to.
I suppose you could do both, and it's not going to upset anyone. You're giving them a choice. Mark?
Yeah, I'd say, although this might be something that you worry about when you're sitting there in front of an application, whatever it is you submit will come in a pack to whoever's reviewing it. So there's no unless an electronic system has failed, there's no skimming of, well, this is in the wrong format, so we're not including it in the pack. You will get everything that has been sent through in a pack, unless something strange or somebody's attached loads of different things weren't asked for. So yeah, so don't worry that formats snaggles will result in your application kind of being skipped or binned. Yeah.
Thanks. Should you still apply for a job even if you don't meet all of the criteria? Mark?
Yeah, I'm happy to start this one off. I would say, of course, very rarely have I recruited and the people you interview meet every single criteria on the form. There is a slight balance, obviously, so it's your chances are better if you meet more of the essential criteria than the desirable criteria. And there are a few things, if it is a specific license or permit or grade 8 on the piano, you can't really get around. If you don't have that, then and that's a core part of the job, then think about applying. But otherwise, I'd always say yes, because if you have the time, which not everyone does, at the very least you'll get some application experience. You might get an interview, you might get some feedback. So yeah, but that being said, if it really is I'm not meeting any of these criteria whatsoever, then do think about it. And again, if you're really not sure, or if a job description is really opaque, or you're looking to move from one kind of institution to another kind of institution, you don't know if the language is different, again, it's always worth giving them a call. I know there's a lot of consternation around degrees when degrees are specifically mentioned, and I guess it's up to your own sadly it is up to your own judgment as to whether that degree requirement is in there because it is the knowledge you pick up on that degree is absolutely needed, or whether it's just kind of been put on. And there's a really interesting publication by Rachel Jennings that was published by NATSCA that looks into museum studies applications in the UK. So whether you need museum studies for museum jobs, and she had a look through all the jobs that were posted, whether or not they said you needed a museum studies degree or not, and then actually whether those degrees were needed for the job, or whether it was just bad recruitment, people just putting it on there. So depending on the kind of job, even if your degree doesn't fit, but you match everything else, I'd say give it a shot, definitely. Yeah, because like I say, very rare do you get a candidate that meets every single criteria across the board. So every job application is applying not meeting at least one of the criteria, or not addressing it in the application stage.
Yep, I agree with everything you said there. Sam?
I completely agree. I was given advice that you never know what recruiters are going to be negotiable on, because quite often they've put all the criteria and sort of half decided if it's essential or desirable, but even if it's essential, if they're getting 5 applications that are the best ones and none of them have met all of the criteria, you don't know which of those criteria they're going to deem like is actually completely essential and which one's like, oh, actually they can learn that on the job. So definitely apply. And I think it's also worth, like, if you look at the world around us, you look at the British government and who they're putting in positions of power, you look at who's been in charge of America for a couple of years, do you really think that they have met all of the essential criteria? Like, why are we holding ourselves back when people who are earning so much more than you'll ever earn in a museum are getting put in these positions without meeting criteria? If Donald Trump can do it, so can you.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Carl.
Sorry. So I was going to say that every position, you know, that everybody will have their own strengths and weaknesses. The most recent job that sort of like I have got, and the one that I'm in at the moment, was very much 3 different aspects of a particular role. So it was looking at special educational needs, it was looking at education, it was looking at careers. I didn't meet all the criteria, and I still went for it, but that was because it was so varied that there was some point that the employer would have to, you know, say, okay, that will be part of your professional development when you start the role, and you tick the other boxes. And I think some people do get put off, even by missing out on 1 or 2. Or out of every job application I've ever scored, nobody has scored full marks. So if you think about it that way, then I think absolutely yes, you should. One thing that I certainly know from working in Leeds Council, and something that the recruitment team have said there as well, is that there is research that says that women are more likely to do this than men as well. So just something to be conscious of is that if you don't meet a couple of the criteria, that I think it definitely is still worth going for the job and seeing how it works out. Obviously, you'll have to use some of your intuition as to whether that essential criteria really is, you know, the end all. And if you don't have it, then you'll get cut at that point. But that basically is just, yeah, intuition.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it's also important to consider you may not think you have a skill or a set of experiences, and you may do. So my current job is the first one that I've got the kind of line management experience. So I had to sort of justify my ability to do that. And I thought, oh no, that's going to be my application scuppered. But when I thought about it, there are actually loads of things that I could bring in, such as working with volunteers and then doing loads of CPD stuff, like this summit, for instance, about ways to coach people, and that was relevant and obviously was enough to get me to interview and get me the job. Jenny, did you want to add anything?
Yes, just really quickly. I was going to say, I think absolutely you can apply for a job if you don't meet all of the criteria. I think applying for a job that's kind of like an aspirational thing is fine. I think being very clear about kind of alternative experience or criteria that you have, that if you're like lacking one of the things that the job specifies, but volunteering something else that could be maybe a substitution is a great way to go about that. Or as a lot of people sorry, are saying in the chat, identifying areas where you want to undertake professional development. Say, I know I'm lacking in whatever, but I've identified, you know, this workshop, I've participated in this online conference, something like that is a great way to make up.
Yeah, and I think if you don't have something on a personal specification, I know we talked about having very structured covering letters, but I wouldn't shy away from it. I wouldn't try and avoid mentioning it. Highlight it as an area that you want to develop in. It might get you a point rather than 0 if you don't mention it at all. And I can see some people nodding, which is good. Carl.
Yeah, I'm just watching the chat and seeing people talking about, you know, the criteria not quite meeting it and whether you should mention it. And the the last response, absolutely, I'd say is really important. That it's important to mention every essential criteria, even if you don't think that you quite hit it. Often, actually, if you think a bit outside of the box, you might find that you have a little bit of knowledge in it, even if you don't have active experience doing it. For example, one that I've seen quite a lot is to do with sort of fundraising experience. If your museum has fundraisers who do all that for you, then you might think, well, I don't have the experience to do that. But if you've worked alongside them and helped them with applications, then you might score, as Tom said, 1 point rather than none. So absolutely mentioning it, I think, is beneficial.
Mark?
To follow on a little bit from what Carl's saying, it's also make sure you don't deprioritize the little stuff. So something that is still on most job descriptions will be familiarity with word processing programs, Excel. There's probably very few people who don't have that, and so you might think, I'm just not going to apply for it. But if in the kind of scoring system, and particularly if you're dealing with 200 applications, it could be that just by losing these little points because you've really invested in making sure that you're expressing your expertise in education or Roman archaeology, so you've deprioritized things that you could easily score 2 points, like Microsoft Word and I have a driving license thing, then it may be that you just drop out of that top table. So even though you do kind of match it, because there are so many applications, you aren't considered. So yeah, so do make sure you address those, in particular the ones around computer software. I frequently see not addressed at all, even though we assume, there's still people out there who perhaps might not be aware of it, that people have it. And so it's, on the one hand, it is a meaningless criteria sometimes. You do need people to have that experience, but make sure you just address it, because that will get you 2 points, and it will push you up the league tables against all the people who haven't done it. It's not especially fair, and it's not at the heart of the recruitment, right? But when we're dealing with such numbers, sometimes it can just be this brutal point scoring game for that initial round, before you really start to think about interview and the person themselves beyond the form.
Yeah, thanks. I would say never assume that the recruiter is going to have knowledge of your skills. Lots of people think, oh, everybody must have Word, so I'm not even going to mention it. And yeah, it is something to avoid. We have come to time, unfortunately. Really fantastic session. So many unanswered questions from the chat, for which I apologise. I'm going to put my Twitter handle into the chat, and if anybody wants to ask anything specific, then hit me up, but not this week, because we're running the summit through till Sunday. Just a shout out to the session we've got this evening at 7 p.m. on how to read a job description, and we'll go into the sort of nitty gritty about how to really dissect those things and what you can tell, what you can expect from a role by looking really analytically at its job description. But I'd like to thank our fantastic panel. So Mark, Jenny, Sam and Carl, thank you so much for attending. It's been a delight to have you here sharing your experiences, and thank you everybody else for coming. Many thanks.